Thank you, Anita. It's always great to be with this group of people. I really appreciate the invitation. And it's, as Anita alluded to much earlier, when we very first started, I have a very substantial practice tied to the startups in Arizona and they're very close to my heart. So I love working with people who are in that entrepreneurial space. And I got companies now that I started working with on day one, almost right as they were licensing technology out of the U of A. And a couple of them are now, really entertaining their exits through acquisition. So it's very exciting and fun and rewarding to sort of walk side by side with these companies as they grow and, end up getting bought. So anyway, it's great to be here. As Anita said, the formation topic is a big one, and I know I've got about 15 minutes on directed content. So, give or take, and I presume there's time for questions, or else, you're welcome to reach out to me later. But I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about things that you all already know about. On the other hand, I want to hit on the high points so that you have a framework. And, what typically happens, and it's interesting, we've got a variety of entities, established here in this group. We've got some people who are LLCs, some people who are C Corps. That's usually what I see when somebody moves to the corporate form. But I thought what might be interesting to talk about is, why do you choose at which stage of your entity's life? And what do I see as the big drivers for switching from an LLC to a corporation if you didn't start as one? And similarly, why would somebody choose an LLC over a corporation in the early days, or maybe forever? What would motivate that? And so, I'll sort of wander around in that space. And then obviously, if there are questions, we can hone in on specifics. But the way that I look at many of the decisions that a company makes, it comes down to four things, four things that are unique to that business. And it's really driven by, how are you funding this business at the moment? Is it your money? Is it your family and friends' money? Or are we going to more sophisticated investors? That leads directly into how expensive any of this stuff cost. How expensive is it? How much do you need to hire a lawyer? What are the fees involved, for forming these entities and getting your organizational documents ready? That drives also complexity. How complex do you want this entity to be in terms of governance and operation? Because in the early days, a lot of complexity for a very small type venture makes no sense. You're just creating expense and headaches. And then the last question is your workforce. Are you really going to be one or two key people for a while, or are you immediately going to need outside human capital, people who can really help you grow quickly? So really depending on the answer to those four questions, and they all relate to each other a little bit, you end up on a sort of sliding scale with, the more complexity you can handle and the more cost you can handle because you're raising money from other people, the more likely you're going to end up in that corporate form. And the more likely you need to be in that form. And that's sort of what I want to talk about. But if we go back to the beginning of many startups and talk about, why would a startup rather be an LLC perhaps in the early days, even if those four factors I talked about end up meaning that you will one day become a corporation? And here's the key answer to that. It's usually the best form for a small group of founders who are self-funding and who are not yet crystal clear, when and whether they're going to need to raise money from people outside of their tight network of family and friends. And one of the biggest advantages of being in that LLC format is that if you choose, you can you can choose to be taxed and will, as a default, be taxed as a partnership. Now, I don't expect you all to necessarily be gurus around tax issues, but generally to let you know, if you're pumping a bunch of money into your venture for the first year, and as is typical, you're not revenue positive yet, you're generating losses, right? And those losses in an LLC that is taxed as a partnership flow right up to your personal return. So if you're also, like many of my startup founders, working in jobs where they're generating ordinary income, you can use your startup losses to offset your ordinary income and reduce your personal tax burden. So there are times that people come to me on day one and say, oh gosh, I think I want to be a corporation. But the truth is maybe not yet, because if you are that person who's going to be self-funding for a year and you're still working at another job, and there are tax benefits to be gained by the fact that you are going to be generating losses in that first year, then let's be an LLC. Because the conversion process, if done at the right time, is not overly expensive. It's not overly complicated. And there's actually statute in Arizona that creates that opportunity quite easily. The other benefits of the LLC format in the early days are that it's cheaper to form. It's easier to operate and govern than a corporation. In Arizona, especially, we do not have annual filing fees for LLCs. So once you form it, which is, if you expedite your formation papers, that's about $80. That's it. Your LLC hums along in Arizona for free. So that's a good thing. And similarly, if you've got one or two founding members in that sort of entity with you, the main document you need is an operating agreement. That is a critical document. And I will tell you, as you sit here, if you've got business partners and an LLC and no operating agreement, I would urgently suggest you get that dealt with, because that document is quite critical in outlining the way that members relate to each other in terms of their duties and obligations to the company, to each other. It covers the gamut of management issues. And without one, you are simply governed by Arizona's statute, which is, it's been recently reformed, and it's a decent statute, but it nowhere near addresses all the issues that you would want addressed. So, but that said, that's a fairly inexpensive document to put into place. So again, getting your LLC off the ground can be quick, easy, inexpensive, simple, and it can permit the use of, early stage losses on your personal tax return if that is something that is beneficial to you. And again, if you're keeping your workforce sort of really focused on the founders again. Now, any of those factors might shift though. And often it's those very shifts that cause people to come see me, because they've been able to kind of get their LLC managed easily, or maybe with just some good advisory help. But there's something coming up in their company's future. And it's usually they've got to raise money. They are bringing in employees or others to assist them, and they want to issue them equity incentives of some type, or they have seen an opportunity that has made them start thinking about what their exit strategy could be. And if it is something like an IPO, let's just say there's a fact that makes that more likely than not, or there are opportunities emerging where their existence as a corporation, just looking down the road, would make more sense. The minute you have the inkling that's appropriate, do it, because the more business life you create as an LLC, when you convert as a corporation, you've got to go back and make all that business life fit your corporate world. You've got to certainly amend license agreements and sometimes employee documents and things like that. So, but if somebody comes to me and says, I want to raise money, it doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to say it's time to move into the corporate form. I mean, there are all these other factors we'll talk about. And if you're just raising money from friends and family, you can still issue convertible notes and those kinds of instruments as an LLC. And often if you do that, your note holders will say, well, that's all great, but if you go raise equity with investors up to a certain amount, then we want you to convert to a corporation. And at that moment in time, we will also want to convert into shareholders. So there are ways to even build in future corporate fundraising into your current LLC fundraising documents. So all of that is possible along a continuum. But if you come to me and say, we're going to go seek venture capital, I'm just going to tell you, let's convert, because they are going to want you to be a corporation. And the work to do all of that, yes, I mean, it's more than it costs in an LLC, because we've got to do your articles, your bylaws. We've got to usually create multiple classes of stock. We've got to help you build a cap table. We've got to do an organizational resolution. So there's, appoint your board, set up your officers. I mean, there's more to do. But, you look a lot more appealing to your typical venture capital group if you figured all that out and got it all pulled together, because they're going to probably ask you to do it anyway. At least every VC firm I've ever been across from has wanted, a corporation, and they want to buy preferred stock. So that, that's a very frequent trigger for conversion. And in fact, I've got a startup, who is soon going to be looking for that kind of fundraising, and they have notes out right now. They're an LLC, but in those notes, they have promised to convert as a corporation before they go raise any more money, which means we'll have to take that step. The other big trigger, as I said, is when we've got people joining the business that are not founders, and there's a desire to issue equity to those people. Now, it's not impossible to do it inside of an LLC. It's quite possible to mimic all of the same equity incentives that we use in a corporation. However, if you have the suspicion, again, that being a corporation one day is probably on the list, I would say do it first, because otherwise we're going to have to go and redo all of your equity incentives, which can be expensive. So, if you can see enough down the road that you're going to raise money with venture capital one day, and you're telling me, but I've got these 3 people I want to bring in, and I want to issue this sort of same idea as options, but we're an LLC, I would suggest you just convert, because inevitably you are going to need to do that. And then we're going to have to go back and redo the entire incentive package. So it's those kinds of milestones along the way that I see influencing people's decisions to move from one form to the other. But I've also seen companies stay in LLC the entire time because they really never needed outside money. They self-funded for a while, and then they were able to generate enough revenue to get themselves where they needed to go. So, there's also not an imperative here that you become a corporation. It is truly a very individualized analysis, and it's important to think about all 4 of those factors, that I really talked about at the beginning. I mean, it's cost, complexity, where's your money coming from, and what is your workforce looking like? And as a startup, I think if you are able to keep those big 4, those factors, and I'm not saying there aren't others, and there usually are, depending on the company, but those 4 are always factors. And they, in my mind, tend to play the biggest role in the way that I guide businesses on the entity they may start with, the entity they would choose to stay with, and or when, if they change, those sorts of issues, when does one of those factors trump another of those factors, because they really all do affect each other. So that's sort of the big picture on, why an LLC versus a corporation, and also why do you then change? Because it's like, if you started with one, why would you switch to another? And then there are companies that start on day one as corporations, and I think in a lot of ways, from their perspective, they're just going full bore toward a destination they've got in mind. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. I would though say to everybody, if you don't already have this, and I'm sure all of your advisors tell you this, but a good CPA is very valuable. And I mentioned this tax issue because taxes drive so many of the decisions that businesses ultimately make, certainly in terms of structuring transactions, and also structuring, you may choose to create affiliates or subsidiaries. You may begin to set that up. And we then, once again, re-examine entity selection. I've had several startups decide that they want to push various business divisions down into separate, wholly owned subsidiaries. And there we are again with an entity selection question. And that particular analysis is heavily influenced by both existing, what tax issues will I create when I do this today? But not just that, if I sell one of those subs, what tax issues will result depending on what form it's in. And there's just an array of things. And so I always recommend to startups that, again, having professionals costs money, but your CPA and your lawyer, I think, usually will save you money in the long run, because their job, is to help you optimize things like taxes and optimize the way you are spending money on things like governance, which is, of course, not the heart of your business, but it is it's the architecture of your business, if you will.